Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. 33 miles. That's how far she was from the nearest hand that could save her. There was no signal, no chance of calling 911. Her voice swallowed by the Gulf of Mexico, her body dragged beneath the surface. Salt water stung her eyes. Blood blurred her vision. She couldn't scream, not anymore. But she could play dead. And it worked. Her husband didn't just try to kill her. He calculated the distance, timed the silence, and let the water finish what his hand started. But she survived. This is the case of Douglas Scott Naher, a Florida man now awaiting trial on charges of first-degree attempted murder. And if you think you've heard it all before, you haven't. It was 1:37 p.m. on July 20th, 2025, when the front desk officer at the Holmes Beach Police Department looked up and froze. A woman stumbled through the door barefoot. Her clothing soaked and clinging, her face almost unrecognizable, one eye swollen shut, hair matted with what looked like sand, seawater, and blood. She didn't speak right away. She leaned on the counter, barely upright. Then she whispered, "He tried to drown me." The statement was chilling in its clarity. She didn't say, "He hit me," or "we fought." She said, "drown." The kind of verb that meant intent, the kind of verb that triggered a very different type of protocol. Patrol units were dispatched immediately to the marina. EMS was called to evaluate the woman, later identified as Stephanie Naher, 58, a local resident. At the hospital, medical staff documented injuries consistent with blunt force trauma, strangulation marks along the neck, and lacerations around the wrists and ankles. Her vitals were unstable, her oxygen saturation low. She had been in the water too long, but not long enough to die. She was still alive, barely. The responding officers at the scene noted a key detail. There had been no distress call from any boat registered to Douglas Scott Naher, no mayday, no call to the Coast Guard, no accidental fall overboard report. In fact, at the very time Stephanie appeared at the station, Douglas had been seen docking his 30-foot vessel back at Holmes Beach Marina, alone. He said nothing to staff. He parked, wiped down the helm, locked the cabin, and left in his truck. He looked calm. The boat was clean, too clean. Stephanie's story, when taken under initial statement protocols later that evening, was as harrowing as it was specific. The morning had begun quietly, just the two of them heading out for what Douglas called a peaceful day on the water. Stephanie brought food, sunscreen, and a hat. He brought the fishing gear. They'd done this before. It was a routine she had come to dread but couldn't avoid. By 9:30 a.m., they were over 30 miles off the coast of Bean Point, well beyond the visible shoreline. That far out, there were no jet skiers, no parasails, no one to see anything. She recalled how the tension started with a snapped fishing line, a small mistake, something trivial. But Douglas, she said, switched. His voice turned cold. His hands gripped the rod too tightly. She knew the signs, and she did what she always did. She removed herself. She quietly lowered herself into the water, grabbed hold of a foam float, and clipped the safety line to the stern. But the next thing she felt was slack. He had cut the line, and the boat began to drift away. By the time he circled back, 15 minutes, maybe 20, Stephanie was exhausted from treading water. She thought maybe he had changed his mind. He hadn't. Instead of helping her in, he grabbed her by the hair and yanked her onto the deck. What followed, she said, was not a fight. It was a beating. He struck her multiple times. She lost count. She lost consciousness. She woke to hands around her throat. He told me I needed to shut up, that nobody would miss me. Stephanie's survival instinct kicked in. She went limp. No breath. No resistance. She let her body go still. After a moment, he dropped her. She crawled behind the helm. When he turned away, she rolled back into the water, this time quietly looping a rope around her ankle. It was attached to the boat. If she drifted, she would be pulled, and she was dragged for what felt like miles. Eventually, when the boat slowed, she found enough strength to climb back up the swim ladder at the stern. Douglas had turned his back. She didn't know if he had seen, but he didn't stop her when she collapsed onto the deck, soaked and bleeding. When the boat docked, she waited until he stepped off. Then she ran. Investigators secured the boat within the hour. No blood was visible, but luminol tests later revealed faint traces wiped clean across the fiberglass surface, particularly near the transom and along the swim platform. A single clump of long dark hair was recovered beneath the helm, tangled in the base of a cleat. GPS data extracted from the boat's onboard system showed multiple stops, none of which were consistent with active fishing. No marine radio activity, no mayday or emergency broadcast. The investigation into the July 20th incident off Florida's Gulf Coast advanced quickly once authorities secured Douglas Naher's 30-foot fishing vessel. The boat, docked without incident just after noon, was impounded at Holmes Beach Marina under order from the Manatee County Sheriff's Office. Officers initiated a forensic analysis less than 4 hours after Stephanie Naher, Douglas's wife, entered the police station battered and soaking wet. The goal was clear: establish a precise timeline and determine whether her injuries aligned with the vessel's behavior at sea. The primary source of truth wasn't testimony. It was the Raymarine Axiom GPS unit mounted near the helm. Digital navigation logs were extracted under warrant at 3:47 p.m., and investigators began plotting the vessel's path from dock to open water and back. What they saw raised immediate concerns. The boat left Holmes Beach at 7:08 a.m., moving steadily west-southwest. No evidence of erratic steering, no signs of mechanical malfunction. It reached open water by 8:40 a.m., but the anomalies came next. At 9:46 a.m., the boat dropped speed and remained stationary approximately 32.8 nautical miles off Beam Point. The engine idled for exactly 12 minutes. No heading changes, no sign of anchoring, and no visible reason for the stop. 18 minutes later, a second pause occurred. This one lasted just under 6 minutes. Again, no course correction, no logged fishing activity, no distress ping. By 10:34 a.m., the vessel was headed back to shore at a consistent 14 knots. No radio call, no emergency signal, no documented attempt to seek help. This pattern was inconsistent with any standard deep-sea fishing route, and there was no gear deployed. The onboard logbook had no bait entries, no catch notes, no timestamps for lines cast or retrieved. The boat had stopped twice, intentionally, and resumed movement without deviation. To Lieutenant Aaron Doyle, lead on-scene investigator, that detail stood out. The vessel behaved like someone following a plan, not reacting to an emergency. That distinction mattered. Back on land, doctors at Blake Medical Center documented injuries sustained by Stephanie. The intake summary noted blunt force trauma to the left orbital socket, bilateral neck bruising consistent with compression, and superficial abrasions on both wrists and ankles. More notably, there was no significant water inhalation. She hadn't drowned, because she hadn't passed the point of resistance. That matched the narrative she had given earlier. She faked unconsciousness to survive. The correlation between GPS timestamps and her account revealed disturbing accuracy. She claimed the first beating occurred after he circled back. That would have aligned with the first full stop on the GPS, 9:46 a.m. The second stop, she said, came after she was dragged behind the vessel by a rope. That matched the 10:08 a.m. in a pause, nearly 20 minutes later. Digital alignment of testimony and onboard data rarely falls into place this cleanly. But in this case, every marker she provided corresponded with a behavioral change in the boat's recorded path. Investigators also submitted a trace collection from the swim ladder and stern cleat. Lab analysts found partial epidermal tissue near the ladder's rubber step and a chipped fingernail fragment embedded in the cleat bolt cavity. No DNA report was filed at this point, but the physical findings supported her claim of being tethered, willingly or otherwise, during the vessel's return to port. By 7:00 p.m. on July 20th, law enforcement had enough to formally classify the incident as highly suspicious. Prosecutors were looped in early. A preliminary theory was now in circulation. The boat didn't just carry a passenger back from the Gulf. It carried the remnants of an event that had not yet been named but was no longer being treated as accidental. One detective noted a secondary issue. There was no record of any Mayday call, not via VHF, not via digital emergency beacon, not even a missed call to 911 from a cell phone. The complete absence of attempted communication wasn't a gap, it was a choice. The data aligned too cleanly, another investigator remarked. Sometimes that's the problem. The boat had returned clean. That was the first concern. No fish, no bait residue, no scuff marks from rods, just polished fiberglass, a dry deck, and silence. Investigators weren't looking for a mess. They were looking for intent. And in cases like this, a boat too clean often says more than one that isn't. At 4:45 p.m. on July 21, 2025, the forensics team boarded the 30-foot vessel under sealed evidence protocol. The vessel had remained locked since its impoundment the day before. Chain of custody was intact. The focus was now the interior cabin, where most assaults at sea happen away from visibility and where digital surveillance rarely reaches. From the first sweep, something felt off. The galley was empty. No cooler, no trash, no open gear bags, no signs of food prep, consumption, or use, not even condensation on the water bottles tucked into a side compartment. The onboard refrigerator was unplugged. A clean bin liner sat unused in the trash receptacle. Forensic technicians flagged it as inconsistent with a day-long fishing excursion. If this had been a normal trip, there would be evidence of human presence, debris, gear, residue. Instead, the cabin looked like it had been pre-cleared, not post-used. But beneath the helm seat, tucked inside a shallow storage hatch, they found a knotted white cotton rag. Folded tight, dry to the touch, but with light brown discoloration across the inner crease. Luminol confirmed blood presence, and further swab testing detected sodium chloride consistent with seawater. The combination suggested it had been used to wipe down a wet, bleeding surface. The location of the rag mattered. It wasn't near the kitchen, it wasn't stored with cleaning gear, and there were no other rags or cloths on the vessel. One tech marked the rag's placement as intentional concealment, not discarded utility. Stephanie's medical report had documented a shallow scalp laceration above her left ear. When she was brought into Blake Medical Center, her hair was matted with blood, mostly dried, partially rinsed by seawater. The blood wasn't flowing anymore when she reached land, but it had been earlier. This matched the approximate drying pattern and sodium concentration found in the rag. Near the swim ladder outside, another technician recovered a fingernail fragment, embedded in the corner groove of a ladder step. That had been documented the previous day, but now they were looking for transfer, blood smears, pressure points, handprints. On the inside of the cabin door, just above the latch, a partial print was lifted using magnetic powder. It matched Stephanie's right hand, and it was angled downward, as if bracing or pushing against the frame. That was the first clear evidence placing her inside the cabin, not just on the deck. A second swipe of Blue Star across the portside wall of the cabin revealed a faint trail of contact transfer. Not spatter, not cast off. Just wiped movement running low across the interior wall from near the door toward the cabin sink. The height of the smear was 18 inches from the ground, consistent with someone crawling or being dragged. Investigators noted that no towels or cloths were found near the site. There was no attempt to clean the streak. But nearby, on the rubber lining of the sink faucet, were two short, dark hairs, later matched to Stephanie through mitochondrial DNA. The combination of these elements changed the profile of the case. It was no longer about whether she'd been hurt. It was about whether someone had tried to eliminate that evidence and failed. One of the investigators later noted, off record, "You don't hide blood on a boat unless you know it shouldn't be there." The crime lab completed surface mapping of the interior using 3D forensic scanning. The downward angle of the smears, the contact zones, and the partial blood transfer near the aft bulkhead created a clear narrative of forced movement, not random injury, and this movement occurred inside the cabin, not outside, not near fishing gear, not during a fall. If blood ends up hidden in the cabin and no one admits anyone else was inside, how did it get there? It was the morning after the incident, July 22, 2025. The calm of Florida's Gulf waters stood in stark contrast to the chaotic storm that had erupted 33 miles offshore just hours before. Now, what had begun as a domestic conflict was rapidly unfolding into a full-fledged attempted homicide investigation. Deputies from the Manatee County Sheriff's Office had secured the immediate scene back on shore. Douglas Scott Naher, 56, had already been taken into custody late the previous night after being spotted in his gray pickup truck near a boat ramp. His wife, battered but alive, had provided a statement that would trigger a chain of investigative procedures now critical to establishing intent and premeditation. At this point, the authorities were not merely trying to confirm whether a domestic assault had taken place. They were piecing together evidence that pointed to a chilling question. Had Douglas planned to kill his wife and leave her lost at sea, untraceable and unrescued? The victim was still recovering at a local hospital under security monitoring. Her facial injuries were documented in detail: bruising along the jawline, contusions across her forehead, and scratches on her throat consistent with manual strangulation. Photographs were taken, swabs were collected. She had stated clearly she had jumped into the water to de-escalate an argument, and Naher had not only abandoned her, He had returned to attack. The violent acts occurred both on board and in the open water. Detectives began their forensic sweep of Naher's boat, which had been impounded earlier that morning. The salt water hadn't washed away everything. On the starboard side railing, they found fresh traces of dried blood, later matched through rapid testing to the victim. There were fingernail fragments lodged in the wood grain near the helm. The interior cabin showed signs of disarray, but not accidental. A closer examination revealed smudges, partial fingerprints pressed with pressure, on the edge of the throttle lever. The medical team confirmed these prints belonged to the victim, consistent with someone fighting to regain control. Investigators also recovered a GoPro-like waterproof camera attached beneath the front deck, originally intended for ocean wildlife capture. Surprisingly, it was still active. Forensics techs immediately extracted the footage, preserving a digital timeline of the incident window. While the video hadn't captured the attack directly, the audio feed recorded part of the commotion. In the background, sounds of splashing, gasping, and muffled cries offered compelling context when paired with the victim's statements. Back at the sheriff's office, lead investigator Date Lisa Morgan began building the timeline. He knew exactly how far they were, she noted, referencing the GPS logs downloaded from the vessel's navigation system. 33 miles from shore. That's not panic, it's calculation. Her focus turned to Naher's digital footprint. Preliminary analysis of his phone's location history matched the coordinates provided by the boat's GPS, adding another layer of corroboration. But there was something else, deleted text threads with a contact saved under a pseudonym. The forensics team flagged it for deeper review. Meanwhile, neighbors interviewed by deputies described Douglas as a man who could charm anyone in public but was impossible to read at home. One neighbor recounted hearing loud arguments coming from the house weeks prior, but dismissed it at the time as just marriage stuff. That assumption was now under serious scrutiny. At no point did Douglas request a lawyer. During his initial interview conducted at 10:23 a.m., he stated, "She jumped. I thought she was okay. She does that." But as the interview continued, inconsistencies began piling up. He claimed he circled back right away, yet GPS logs showed a 23-minute delay before the vessel reversed course, and even then, it didn't fully stop. The detectives didn't press him aggressively, yet. The strategy was simple. Let the forensics speak first, then confront him when the evidence locked into place. With video, injuries, witness context, and digital tracking aligning, they were nearing probable cause for an elevated charge. There was no ambiguity left. The act wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was a series of decisions, abandon, return, attack, flee, that led investigators to reframe the event as an attempted execution at sea. And it wasn't just about violence. It was about power, control, erasure. He didn't need a weapon. The ocean was the weapon, and he used it with terrifying precision. The morning of July 23, 2025, marked a crucial shift. 2 days had passed since Douglas Scott Naher's arrest near Manatee County, Florida. His wife remained in the hospital, recovering from cranial contusions, facial lacerations, and blunt force trauma. Detectives had finished combing the vessel, a white center console powerboat moored under temporary impoundment, and cataloged more than a dozen trace samples. But what they needed next wasn't on the water. It was sitting behind reinforced glass in a 10-by-12-foot interview room, wearing a disposable jail-issued uniform. Douglas wasn't immediately cooperative. According to Detective Kelsey Morales, who led the initial sit-down, Naher oscillated between silence and surface-level grievances. He claimed his wife panicked and jumped during an argument, describing her injuries as self-inflicted chaos. He said the whole thing was a misunderstanding between husband and wife, and accused the deputies of overreacting to a marriage dispute. But as Morales noted in her report, Naher never once asked if his wife had survived. The interview was recorded from multiple angles. About 23 minutes in, Morales introduced a new element, GPS data. Cell tower triangulation and onboard marine GPS logs placed the vessel stationary at coordinates roughly 33 miles off Bean Point, farther than recreational fishing routes typically extend. The boat had not moved for over an hour before turning back toward the coast, which contradicted Naher's claim that he was circling to find her. The digital forensics didn't lie. Detectives also confronted Naher with forensic images of the victim's bruising. The pattern on her throat was consistent with manual strangulation, not from treading water or impact with the boat. The depth and spacing of the marks suggested prolonged force, not a split-second panic. The bruises along her collarbone aligned with fingertip compression, while abrasions along her ribs appeared defensive. There were also red ligature marks on her left wrist, raising speculation about restraint before or during the assault. Pressed for an explanation, Naher's demeanor hardened. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, pushing his chair back. "You people act like I'm a monster." Detectives paused the session, allowing tensions to simmer. On the second attempt, now with his attorney present, Naher declined to speak further. The session ended without a formal confession, but investigators had already anticipated that. What they were really after wasn't an admission, it was inconsistencies. Outside the interview room, another development unfolded. The victim had regained partial use of her voice. From her hospital bed, she gave her first formal statement to a deputy with a body-worn camera. According to the transcript, she said, "He waited until I thought it was safe. Then he came back and tried to drown me. I played dead so he'd stop. That's the only reason I'm alive." She stated that after their argument escalated, she climbed into the water, hoping to de-escalate. But once she was in the open sea, he severed the anchor line and drove off, leaving her floating. When he returned, he was calm, until he wasn't. She described how he grabbed her by the hair, dragged her toward the stern, and forced her head underwater multiple times while shouting threats. The last thing she remembered was the pressure on her neck and the sound of water rushing into her ears before blacking out. Crime scene technicians continued analyzing the vessel. Hair consistent with the victim's was recovered from a stern-side cleat. Dried blood droplets were located under the rear seat cushion, confirmed by presumptive testing and matched via DNA within 48 hours. No medical conditions or injuries predating the incident could account for the pattern of bruising. At this stage, prosecutors began drafting a motion for pretrial detention without bond. The evidence, both physical and testimonial, supported a charge of attempted first-degree murder with a secondary enhancement for domestic battery by strangulation. Florida Statute FAR 782.04 permitted such classification, especially given the intent, location, and manner of assault. The fact that the incident occurred offshore, where emergency services were inaccessible, further solidified the state's position of premeditation. To the public, the attack was already being referred to as the boat incident. But in the sheriff's office, it was no longer a case of domestic violence. It was a calculated maritime assault with intent to kill. As the narrative tightened, one looming question remained: why did he return at all? On July 23, 2025, Douglas Scott Naher sat across from detectives for a second interview. This time, he wasn't agitated, he was guarded. His attorney was present, but investigators had more than just questions. They had data. Stephanie Naher's waterproof smartwatch had survived the saltwater. It showed a sudden heart rate spike at 12:13 p.m. on July 21st, the moment she hit the water, and a sharp drop 16 minutes later when she faked unconsciousness to survive. Combined with the vessel's GPS, the timeline was no longer based on testimony. It was corroborated by hard data. Douglas claimed she jumped in, that he circled back, but his voice wavered when shown her bruised face on body cam footage from first responders. He offered a different story. She slipped, hit her head. Still, he denied any intent to harm, but forensics said otherwise. Bruising on her neck matched the pattern of manual strangulation. A forensic pathologist confirmed the injuries were not consistent with an accident. They were deliberate. Add to that the blood traces found on a cloth in the cabin and Douglas's own words, "She's dramatic. She can handle herself." And prosecutors saw intent. Investigators weren't chasing a confession anymore. They were building a case based on what couldn't lie: timestamps, tissue damage, and silence in the face of evidence. By July 25, 2025, the case against Douglas Scott Naher had reached a critical juncture. Investigators had mapped the physical evidence from the boat, verified Stephanie's injuries with forensic specialists, and corroborated her account using biometric and GPS data. Now, their focus shifted toward behavioral patterns, and Douglas's past didn't hold up well under scrutiny. Manatee County detectives requested and obtained search warrants for Naher's digital history, including archived 911 records, domestic incident reports, and prior restraining order attempts. A 2022 report from Sarasota surfaced, documenting a domestic dispute involving Stephanie and Douglas. At the time, no charges were filed. Stephanie had refused to cooperate, citing fear and a desire to keep the peace. but the officer's notes described visible bruising and a hostile, controlling demeanor from Douglas. It was the first verified glimpse into a longer timeline of coercive control. Neighbors from their Bradenton neighborhood recalled arguments audible from inside the home. One mentioned seeing Stephanie with dark sunglasses in late June during a grocery run, despite the overcast weather. Another remembered Douglas berating her in public. These weren't isolated accounts. They illustrated a sustained pattern of psychological domination, which prosecutors would later characterize as escalating conduct leading to near-fatal violence. Detectives also reviewed Douglas's phone metadata. Texts recovered through forensic tools revealed possessive language and accusations. Phrases like, "You're nothing without me," and "Don't embarrass me again out there." The tone wasn't sudden, it was habitual. And in one unsent draft, time-stamped July 20, just a day before the incident, Douglas had typed, "If she wants to swim, she'll get what she asks for." He never hit send, but the draft, captured during a sync backup, became part of the evidentiary timeline. When investigators re-interviewed Stephanie on July 25th, they approached with caution. Her account remained consistent, but this time she added details. Douglas had grown increasingly volatile after she mentioned divorce in early July. He began monitoring her phone, checking her location history, and accusing her of infidelity. The trip out to sea, she said, was framed as a reconciliation effort. She now believed it was a setup. One detective noted in his case file, "Victim's narrative aligns with trajectory of domestic homicide cases. Escalation, isolation, attempted silencing." The FBI Domestic Violence Threat Assessment Protocol, DVTAP, confirmed the risk markers. Douglas met over 80% of the thresholds, including prior threats, escalation of physical aggression, isolation tactics, and access to weapons. While no charges from prior incidents existed, prosecutors moved to introduce the pattern of conduct under Florida Statute Borrower 90.4042, allowing evidence of prior bad acts to establish motive, intent, and absence of mistake. Douglas's defense team immediately objected, citing lack of convictions, but the court was preparing for a pretrial admissibility hearing. The goal wasn't just to prove what happened on July 21st. It was to show it was predictable, deliberate, and preceded by a long chain of red flags that had gone unaddressed. By July 23, 2025, formal charges were filed: attempted first-degree murder and domestic battery by strangulation. Douglas Scott Nair, arrested days earlier, remained in custody with no bond. The evidence, physical, digital, and testimonial, left little room for misinterpretation. GPS logs confirmed the boat had been idle 33 miles offshore during the exact time frame the victim said she was abandoned. Her injuries, documented by ER physicians, showed blunt force trauma to the head and visible signs of strangulation. A secondary bruise pattern around her neck matched her statement. She had faked unconsciousness to survive. A dash cam from a distant fishing vessel picked up muffled screams, too faint for voice ID, but aligned with the victim's timeline. Meanwhile, Nair's claim that she swam back to shore on her own raised serious doubts. The current, distance, and lack of flotation made that nearly impossible. Investigators also uncovered a history of coercion and emotional control. Though never formally reported, accounts from neighbors and a former coworker helped establish a behavioral pattern, one that prosecutors would likely use to show motive and escalation. Through an advocate, the victim released a brief statement: "Surviving doesn't mean it didn't happen. Speaking up saved my life." As of July 28, 2025, Nair remains jailed in Manatee County, awaiting his next court appearance. Prosecutors are confident in their case. The community, shaken but alert, has turned the spotlight onto domestic violence, especially in isolated, unchecked environments. Looking back, I didn't think I'd make it out of that boat alive. But survival isn't just luck, it's choice, courage, and the quiet voice that tells you to keep going when everything else says stop. If you're ever in a situation that threatens your safety, please know, silence protects no one. Speak, run, tell someone. You are not alone. This case isn't just about crime, it's about power, fear, and the strength it takes to reclaim your life. I hope my story reminds someone out there, you deserve better, and walking away could be the bravest thing you ever do. What would you do if your escape meant diving into the unknown? Literally. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below, let me know where you're watching from, or what part of the story stuck with you. And if this video moved you in any way, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next one.